Fallout 76's story is a tragedy, and honestly for me, I feel like this really does have a double meaning. Of course, the main story, the vanilla story of Fallout 76, ends with everyone dying. It is a tragedy in the traditional way, but even further, I feel like one of the biggest tragedies of Fallout 76 overall is that the main story was told in the way it was. Fallout 76, of course, had a plethora of bugs, problems between launch and now. There's been this consistent battle between Bethesda and the issues. But one of the things that I felt like was a core issue was actually a deliberate choice by them, and that is to tell the original story in this passive way, where in many ways, instead of actually having an interactive storytelling experience, it's more like reading a book or listening to a podcast about what happened. And in this video, I want to tell you why this is so disappointing. And it'll probably get you a little bit more bummed out about the game, but also in some ways maybe like the game a bit more, kind of. You see, with West Virginia and Fallout 76, there are two major things that make it pretty unique from other settings. Firstly, there were no direct nuke hits, compared to Boston in Fallout 4, or even Washington, D.C. in Fallout 3. West Virginia didn't have a ton of major landmarks or really anything making it a prime target for an attack, which when you look at the Fallout games, especially the more modern ones, that is unique. But even further, it is the closest to the bombs dropping that day in 2077 that a Fallout game has ever taken place, outside of the Fallout 4 intro sequence and a few other small things here or there. A full game being set just 25, now 26 years later with Wastelanders is unique. And I think from a storytelling perspective, those two aspects could have made this one of the most interesting and unique Fallout experiences we've had thus far. Imagine with Fallout 76, instead of us wandering out of a vault 25 years after being stored in there, we actually just come in a few years or even a few months as a traveler into West Virginia. Pretty similar to how things start off in Skyrim. West Virginia was a place relatively unaffected by the nuclear blast. We come to the region, finding the immediate destruction and aftermath, but most of that being from the chaos from the people, not because of nuclear blasts affecting everything. And if this was how the game started, what you would find are the 5 major factions of Appalachia, the Free States in the Mire region. The Free States are unique in that they were actually a group of individuals who set up bunkers, set up rations for themselves, and basically called the apocalypse with government interference. They were some of the few that were prepared. They were correct about government conspiracy. So you'd have to imagine this would be a fairly unique faction in that they would have a major I told you so attitude, and even further an extreme reluctance to help other factions or even talk to you because why do they need you? I think that in and of itself could create some interesting dynamics right off the bat, earning their trust through a variety of quests. Similarly, I think the Enclave would almost function like Fallout 76's version of the Institute. You probably wouldn't really have access to their bunker or even their hotel because, again, why do they need you? You're just some random guy. You'd be able to maybe see their bunker or see the entrance to it, but only otherwise hear rumblings from the other factions or characters, at least for now. But then, one of the first groups that actually does welcome you or actually does interact with you would potentially be Taggerty's Thunder, a group running military exercises in the region that now find themselves in a more confused state because higher command is inaccessible. They can't get into contact with anyone. But fortunately, they are recruiting. So you go through the training course, actually become a member, and do several quests for this faction, getting acquainted with what was otherwise basically just a military group. You discover their extreme reluctance to work with the other civilian factions because they almost view themselves as above them as a military group and well trained. But then after several quests would come the very interesting and big twist. You finally get radio communications established again. Elizabeth Taggerty, the leader of Taggerty's Thunder, hops on the radio only to find a message from Roger Maxson of the Brotherhood of Steel. This plot point in particular I think could have been executed so interestingly and well by Bethesda. If they kept it a secret, that would be a huge twist. Spend a couple of hours getting acquainted with the faction, doing their quests, and then finally, when you think they're going to get a directive from the US Army, they actually get a directive from the Brotherhood and end up joining them. You can see the establishment and formation of this, people's reluctance to join, which is all already documented in the Fallout 76 lore. We would just now be able to actually experience it for ourselves. But really, the two most interesting groups would likely be the Responders and the Raiders. The Responders would almost be like the Minutemen of Appalachia. Appalachia. Firefighters, cops, and EMTs before the Great War who are now just trying to help people. But as you acquaint yourself with this faction, it could give you a first-hand account of the horror of the apocalypse, or really the ensuing apocalypse on the region. You could hear stories from the responders who lost their families, lost their kids, or even what they're dealing with on the front lines of trying to help and save other people as society devolves. An extremely unique interaction with an entire group of first-generation survivors. This is one of those things I really hoped they explored in Fallout 76, and although they did somewhat, I don't think they did a good enough job. And I think the responders would have been a great outlet to actually explore that. And conversely, on the other side of things, the raiders would have even been more interesting. The raiders in Fallout 76 weren't just born thieves. Instead, as you encounter the raiders here, what you would find is a group of rich tourists. Over the first few quests, you get acquainted with them, you don't really think much of them, but over time, you discover how they actually start doing what is necessary for survival. They start out asking for help, but when it doesn't come, they start stealing, they start killing. What could have begun as pompous rich folk eventually devolves into tribalism. This would have been unique as it's something we see so many times in Fallout games, but we never actually get to really see the transformation. How people actually turned into raiders, how perhaps they got addicted to chems, how their moral compass really went astray. This also would give you an easy outlet for a proper evil playthrough, which people have been wanting in Fallout games for a while now. And in my ideal Fallout 76, this would only really serve as the first act of the game. Your introduction into the world, the people here, and really seeing the horrors of the bombs dropping. Of course, as the game progressed, it would be more like a traditional Fallout. After you help some of these factions, you would hear about the conflicts one has with another, just helping them set some stuff up in their various quests. But then, one of the next big milestones would be the appearance of the Liberators, these bizarre robots clearly from a communist origin that have seemingly waged war on Appalachia out of nowhere. They wouldn't be there from the start of the game, but rather just one day start showing up, and get to see the reactions from the various factions as to what's happening. Is this wave 2? Is there another great war on the way? Shortly thereafter, the super mutants would start appearing, and this would really wreak havoc. A commendable foe in Appalachia that people would have to either unite or falter against. And what this would lead us to is the eventual inclusion into the Enclave, being invited into the White Springs bunker. From this initial questing, we made a name for ourselves. We were noticed. And here you would discover that the Enclave was actually releasing these horrors on Appalachia in order to reduce the DEFCON level, to be able to launch nukes against their foes. There could be a genuinely tough player choice, the Enclave asking us for help, all the while having an extremely safe bunker, some of the most advanced technology in the region, so even though they have some questionable morals, perhaps it is all for the greater good. And then as you progress the story from here, you start to really see the suffering of some of the factions. Things were bad before, but now in the region, things are only getting worse. You'd help the responders set up the Fire Breathers unit to combat some of these. And as you progress the Enclave story, you'd start to hear rumblings that maybe some dark stuff happened beforehand. How the leader of the Enclave, Eckert, actually took out a ton of members that disagreed with him, and he might even have a more horrific plan in the works for the future. Until one day, when you return to the Enclave bunker to turn in a quest to Eckert, you find it completely wiped out. All of the inhabitants now deceased, and Modus pulls you aside, describing how Eckert released something horrible, but not getting into specifics, and Modus had him killed as he tried to turn on the machine. This could be one of those crazy, interesting twists to the game. As you approach the second half of it, or even just the final act overall, one of the major factions is more or less wiped out in its entirety after doing something horrific that we don't really know what is exactly. Now, of course, as many of you can probably deduce, what actually happened was the scorched beasts were released by the Enclave on Appalachia, spreading the scorched plague. This is an attempt to actually lower the DEFCON level to finally be able to use the nukes, but I think one of the cool ways this could have been implemented is just don't tell the player. 1, don't tell them what was released, and 2, don't show them the scorched plague. The game would continue. You do a couple of quests and kind of be confused like, well, what happened? Then gradually over time, you'd start to get mysterious reports. A couple couple here and there, you'd get them through the main quest, talking to some of the factions as to how people are getting some kind of new odd disease, and even reports of these new giant creatures being sighted. But of course, as anything with this, there would be a lot of dissent. Many people not believing it, some of the major factions writing it off as myth and being happy that the Enclave were taken down as you inform them. And the key would be to not see this for ourselves. We'd have to rely on the secondhand accounts from the NPCs of the world until it gradually becomes a larger problem, something you will discover via the Brotherhood of Steel questline. And via this, you would finally start to actually encounter scorched beasts for yourselves. And imagine that moment, being fairly well into this game, established in the world, and then for the first time seeing a scorched beast fly out and attack you. That would be a huge moment, and probably a very memorable one for Fallout games overall. The Brotherhood immediately becomes dedicated to fighting off these beasts and also finding out what's happening. You'd explore the Cranberry Bog region to find houses wiped out, many people converted to these new scorched creatures or just dead altogether. A change in the landscape as you find fissure sites starting to pop out. Via this, you would have to actually try and convince some of the other factions that this threat is real, but again, many wouldn't believe you. The Brotherhood are fully on board, seeing it for themselves, but the others don't trust the Brotherhood. They never got along to begin with, so why would they believe them now? Thinking this is just a ploy for them to gain resources and power in the region. And then over time, you would gradually see people start dying. Brotherhood members contracting the disease, falling victim to it, or just dying in battle against these scorched beasts. Some of the other factions would begin to realize this is a real thing and they have to fight against it. Except in very human fashion, each of the factions would have their own solution to it. The Brotherhood of Steel thinking advanced weaponry with ultrasight weapons is the key. The Free States arguing what we really need are more bunkers for people to hide in and wait this out. The Responders thinking a cure is the only way to solve this problem long term, and the Raiders just saying, hey, let's take as many supplies as we can and flee the region, we can't beat this. Over time, as you go through the quests and try and bring some of these solutions to light, you see the map gradually changing, the Cranberry Bog region getting more and more infested and taken over, and it actually progressing to other regions. Some of the major story DLC characters you did quests for in the past would start dying, whether it be for the plague or even just in the war that was beginning. This would be unique in that it's a very different Fallout story. You would start out and kind of establish a world fairly divided, where everyone's against each other, and end up in one where it's more united. A common threat presented itself, and many of the major factions now want to defeat it, each having their own method, but all against a collective goal. Now, how the story ends, I don't really know. I mean, I guess you could go the route of everyone dies, but it seems kind of anticlimactic if you live through it. Perhaps many people die, but some of the things like the inoculation project end up succeeding, so society is in bad shape, but we are no longer subject to the plague. Now it's more finding a different solution. You launch the nuke at the Queen, have the big Scorched Beast Queen battle, and something happens, but I'm sure some Bethesda writers could have come up with a better solution than just everyone dies. But for this story to be convincing or interesting, I still think a decent chunk of people need to die. And actually, one of the other really cool parts that could have come from this in a DLC would be actually greeting the Vault 76 Vault Dwellers. Or maybe not even a DLC, maybe just towards the latter half of the story, the final act, how you actually beat the Scorched Beast. Rather than us actually being the ones to leave the vault, entering into a bizarre world, Bethesda could have basically flipped the script. We actually lived in this world. We saw the formation and transformation of many of these factions and the release of this plague. And instead, we would be the ones informing these newly found Vault Dwellers who are here to help what exactly happened. And I just think that too could have been a really cool and unique Fallout experience, something that so many times we've been on the other side of. So really, what I just told you about was the story of Fallout 76 told in a more active way. That's a story you'll get if you listen to the holotapes or read through the terminal entries. But for me, I think the story of Appalachia is one of the best Bethesda has ever written. It really is top tier. Wastelanders was interesting, Fallout 4 and New Vegas had interesting or compelling stories, but this one, from a broad level, I think has some of the most potential. Perhaps because in those past games we've done those stories, I think Fallout 76 could have been really unique on a character level, on being able to see the transformation of these individuals, how they actually react to society collapsing. We don't really get that as much in some of the other Fallouts. We see it several hundred years after the fact, but in 76 it would have been unique. But instead of us actually getting to experience that, we just got to hear about it. Even in Fallout 76's main story, there's only actually 2 characters you can really interact with. There's a bunch you could hear about, you could learn about, but of course you kind of know know their actual fate, I guess the Overseer being the one exception there. But in general, this is a story with a lot of twists and turns, a lot of different things happening that are actually genuinely surprising, genuinely interesting. But instead of us getting to experience that, we got one where we know the ending. From day one, you find a desolate region and everyone died. You know that already. And after hearing this video, after hearing that story of what Fallout 76 could have been, don't you want to play that game? After playing the story myself and doing the research for a couple of videos, it just really made me sad because it sounds so good. Now, of course, one of the problems potentially with this is it would have been a lot more difficult to actually incorporate that story into a multiplayer game. It would have been more like a traditional Fallout, but it definitely would have been possible. Using the same technology that made Wastelanders possible, you could have had a lot of it just work out of the box. Perhaps for the big Scorched Beast Queen fight, or the Scorched actually appearing in the area, you could make that kind of some crazy event that happens 1 month after the game releases. All of a sudden it'll start popping up one day in an update, and it would have been this crazy, interesting online experience. Actually seeing the world of Fallout 76 progressively change and evolve. And frankly, the aspect about this that I too find so disappointing is, not only was Fallout 76's story great but told in a bad way, Bethesda still is not capitalizing on some of the unique opportunities they have with Fallout 76. If you actually look at Wastelanders, I thought the story was okay, not the best, not the worst, but it was definitely good enough. But really, how different would the main quest of Wastelanders be if it was told, let's say, 100 years later? Yeah, there'd be a few things that would have to be switched, but overall, the main story beats would basically be identical. And even further, as we look ahead to this new Brotherhood of Steel questline, rather than trying to look at some of the unique or interesting groups of the region, the newly created factions, or just creating new factions, Bethesda is instead relying on the familiar, the Brotherhood of Steel, and even now in the past, the Raiders and the Settlers, two broadly appealing groups. Of course, we don't actually know how the Brotherhood questline will work. Perhaps they will take more advantage of the setting, but it really feels like as they go back to the Brotherhood of Steel again after the first one got wiped out, it's more so just relying on what's comfortable and what's going to sell copies because it's a recognizable name, not taking a chance on something different or unique. Overall though, one thing that I am holding out on, and I have been for a long time now, is the fact that Fallout 76's main story could potentially be adapted to a more real-time experience in a mod. If this game ever ends up getting mod support, which will likely come at some point, and it does give you the level of access that is even close to what we've had in past games, creating a mod that actually adapts the main story of 76 into a real-time experience like a traditional Fallout would be amazing. And it also would be very doable compared to some of these other remake or overhaul mods. You already have the world, you already have all the voice acting, you already have the story and some of the quests you would need to create. That'd be a really cool experience, a massive undertaking in its own right, but a really cool experience if done correctly. But overall, that's going to wrap it up for this video. How I really view Fallout 76's story is one of the biggest tragedies of the game, mainly because it had so much potential. They were so close with it, but it ended up more so just being disappointing due to that storytelling nature. As always, again, I thank you all for watching. Hopefully you found this video entertaining or just informative, but until next time, I hope to see you all later.